Alright, now we are down to the final two videos, and today I'm going to talk about the Century South, which has the New Orleans Jazz, the Miami Sharks, Dallas Stars, Houston Twisters, and the Orlando Astros. So let's get this video started with the Astros. So we get this video started with the Orlando Astros. Man, this team was a train wreck to start the year. They started off 0-6, but the worst thing was 4 of those first 6 losses were within a touchdown strike to win. As a matter of fact, that first game of the season at Detroit, they had a 14 and a 10-point lead, and they blew it to let Detroit win. Then they won 2 in a row against their division rival Houston. Then they lost 3 in a row to start off at 2-9. But then they went on to go 5-2 the rest of the season to finish in a record of 7-11. So quite a good finish for them for this year. On offense, they've scored 18th most points, so not bad for them. They were second in yards, which is very impressive. They got almost 380 yards a game, although how much you want to bet, a lot of that's simply because they were so down and behind they had to catch up. They were 8th in rushing and 6th in the air. So they had a lot of really good offense, pretty much. That's quite impressive, even though they didn't score a lot of points comparison. But that defense, they were 36 in scoring, so that's definitely not good. 31 against the yards. They were 26 against the run and 31 against the pass, so that defense was definitely not good at all. So their quarterback, Milton Hester, had over almost 4,300 yards, had a completion percentage of under 60% though, so that's not good. He had 28 touchdowns, not bad, but 20 picks, so that's definitely not good. So it's a question whether or not he'll remain the starter for next year, or he'll even be the future of the Orlando Astros. However, like I said earlier, this team was second in the league in rushing yards, and boy were they. Their leading runner was Frank Evans, who rushed for over 2,000 yards. He rushed for 2,045. He might even lead the league in yards, so I have to check that up. But even if he did, that's not as impressive as it would be in the NFL, since remember, it's 2 extra games instead of 16. But he did get 15 touchdowns though, so he got a whole lot of yards and a lot of touchdowns too. The receiver Joshua Moses, who had only 60 receptions but had over 1,300 yards and 9 touchdowns, he averaged almost 22 yards a grab. That's pretty impressive. And right behind him was Jonathan Swanson, who had over 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns. And Frank Evans also showed to be a receiving threat too, getting almost 80 receptions, over 850 yards, and 6 touchdowns too. So a dual threat running back they have in Frank Evans. What a good find he was. They had a really good offensive line. Their leading tackler was their linebacker James Lyons, who had 151 tackles plus 5 sacks. And right behind him was their cornerback Martin Tarver, who had 102 tackles, which is pretty impressive for a corner, plus 3 sacks too. And speaking of sacks, this team did not get a lot of sacks, but their leading sacker was Charles McCarty, their defensive end, who had 13, so a very good year for him. And this team, oh my god, they got no interceptions really. I don't even think they got 10 interceptions total. Their leading interceptors was 2. That defense is definitely not good at all. I mean, the highlights, Frank Evans, of course. They're one of the league's dual threat running backs. That 5-2 finish the year, and that really strong offense. But man, they went 5-11, and they had 6 games where they were within a touchdown strike of winning. So just think of it. If they turned it around, they could have been possibly 13-5 and been a major playoff threat if their defense didn't just hold them back. Especially those 4 games to start the year where they had a shot to win. This team got blown out twice by Miami. That's a disaster. This team, however, did do a good job against New Orleans, including the last week of the year where they destroyed them 42-7. They put up a good game against Baltimore twice, including beating them earlier in the year. They beat San Antonio at their place. That was pretty impressive. They swept Houston. So this team has beaten teams that are pretty good in the league this year. But what they need to do, they need to fix that defense especially. But if they can get that shit right, they might be able to turn around. I don't think they're going to probably be a playoff team next year, but who knows? Maybe they could push to 10-8. That would be quite a turnaround. Then next up is the Houston Twisters, who are a really strange team. They were kind of bad, but at the same time they finished 9-9, which is impressive. They started off the year 2-2. Then they went on to lose 4 straight, including 2 to Orlando. That was pretty bad. Then all of a sudden they went on to win 3 in a row to get back at 5-6. Then they would lose 2 in a row, including going to Las Vegas and losing 51-0. It was the biggest shutout in PFA history. Surprisingly, they actually didn't play like that bad, so it's incredible how that game turned out. But then they went on to win all but one of their games to finish 9-9, including beating the previously undefeated at home Chicago 71ers in overtime. So that was a pretty impressive victory. But overall, 9-9, not a good season at all. They were 31 in terms of scoring, so bottom half in terms of scoring. They were 17th in terms of yards, so they got pretty good yard production. They were 10th in rushing, that was very good, but 22nd in the air, so that's not good. They were 20th in scoring, so they were just the top average. They were 25th in yards allowed. That's not good. They were 35th in running yards around. That is definitely not good. And they were 15th against the pass, which is very good. So this team is all over the place in terms of stats. Their main quarterback was Stephen Hargrove, who missed the final 2 games of the year due to a broken jaw. He threw for under 3,000 yards. He had under a 59% completion percentage, so that's not good. 16 touchdowns, but he only threw 8 interceptions, so that's pretty impressive. And right behind him was his backup, Anton Gillis, who played the final 2 games of the year. He had 1,000 yards, 6 touchdowns and 3 interceptions, and almost a 60% completion. So they seem at least solid when it comes to quarterback, but they got to get more touchdowns if they want to have any shot at doing good next year. And just like Orlando had Frank Evans, Houston has Joseph Bolin at running back, who got almost 1,600 yards and 11 touchdowns. Plus, he had over 750 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. He had a very impressive year, and this division apparently is full of dual threat running backs. However, this team did not have really good receivers, with their leading receiver, Robert Brown, having just over 1,150 yards and 6 touchdowns, so that's definitely not good. Although their other receiver, Thomas Newman, had 100 receptions, not bad for him, and had almost 1,100 yards but just 4 touchdowns. This team did not have a very good offensive line at all. They were really banged up with injuries. 2 very good studs for tackling, and that's their linebacker, John McKnight, who had 143 tackles, and right behind him was their strong safety, George Forrest, who had 124 tackles, plus 5 sacks. Not bad for a strong safety, although they're supposed to be getting more interceptions. And they had 2 10-plus sackers, with Jesse Rutherford, their defensive end, with 13. And right behind them was their other defensive end, Joseph Watson, who had 12 sacks. And then when you get to interceptions, this team only got 7 picks, which is unbelievably bad. But their quarterback, Billy Chaffee, who had over half those interceptions with 4. So this team did not get a lot of pressure in terms of making turnovers. Highlights include the fact that this team, although they struggled, they did beat a lot of pretty good teams. They beat Las Vegas at home 20-17. They destroyed and absolutely dismantled the Denver Miners at home. They beat the New Orleans Jazz at home. They beat Dallas at home on Sunday night in a defensive struggle. They beat Miami at their own place, which gave them their final loss of the year. They beat at Chicago 30-24 in overtime. That almost prevented Chicago from getting home field advantage. So they had a lot of very good wins. But, of course, they had some very disappointing losses. They got swept by Orlando. They lost 51-0 at Las Vegas, which is the biggest loss in PFA history. So, man, this team has a lot of problems to deal with. And to make matters worse for them is they have a pretty high pick, so they might not get an impact player immediately in a draft. So that's going to be problematic. So I'm not sure what to say about this team. I mean, yeah, they were good enough to beat a whole bunch of good teams, but, man, they lost a lot of bad games, too, including that 51-0 blowout. So I don't know what to say about this team going forward. I guess we'll have to wait and see in 2017. Well, this team had a very disappointing end of the season, and that's the Dallas Stars. This team started off 3-0, then 5-1, and they soared all the way to 9-2 and looked like they were going to easily run away with the Century South and maybe even possibly clinch a first-round bye. But then they collapsed the last weeks, falling to 9-5. Then they absolutely obliterated and dominated the Minneapolis Kitsune to sit themselves at 11-5, and they're at home against New Orleans, and it looked like if they won, they would have won the division outright and get ready to go into the playoffs. only to lose at home to New Orleans, which was a disaster. And then they would go on to lose to Miami next week, which would officially knock them out of the playoffs. Oh, what a disappointing finish to this season that was, because this team was just so good pretty much the entire year. On offense, they were 22nd scoring. They didn't score a lot of points. 19th in terms of yards, so slightly above average. They were 12th on the ground, which is pretty good, but 23rd in the air, so that's definitely not good. But this team's main strength was defense. They were 10th in scoring, so they allowed the 10th most points, least points in the league. They were 17th against the yards, but their main problem on defense was they were 34th in yards allowed on the ground. They allowed almost 138 yards on the ground. That's terrible. But they had the 6th best pass defense in the league, so they could not stop the run, but they stopped the pass very, very, very well. Their leading starter for quarterback was Troy Hill, who missed the game due to injury. However, he passed for almost 3,600 yards. He had a completion percentage of 65.3%, so he had a good performance. 22 touchdowns and 9 picks for a QB rating of 92. So they had very good production out of quarterback position. This team, however, was not good on the ground. Their leading rusher was Justin Becker, who just barely had over 1,000 yards, but only 8 touchdowns too. Their wide receiver, Randy Hale, led the team with almost 86 receptions, over 1,350 yards, but only 7 touchdowns. And right behind him was their other wide receiver, Billy Martino, with just barely under 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns. So just like Troy Hill, they did not do well in terms of getting touchdowns. They got to fix that for next year. The offensive line was all over the place, but they have one of the best offensive tackles in the league in Elias Boner, who didn't allow a single sack at all this season. That is just incredible. They had a one-man wrecking crew at linebacker, and that was Victor Shores, who had 140 tackles, so a very strong performance for him. They had 2 10-plus sackers with their defensive end, Casey Walton, with 15, and right behind him was their other defensive end, Charles Hendricks, with 11 sacks. So very good season for them. And then you get to interceptions. This team got a solid amount of interceptions, but they didn't have anyone that really got a lot, except their free safety, Richard Thatcher, with 4 interceptions. And unfortunately for him, he got injured for the final 4 games of the year, so that really hurt his chances to increase that amount. This team overall had a strong start to the year. Remember, they started off 9-2. They actually, believe it or not, were like the reverse of the Orlando Astros. They were 2-9 to finish the start at one point, but then they finished 7-11. The Dallas, on the other hand, they were 9-2, and they went on to go 2-5 their final 7 games to finish 11-7. So that was a very, very, very disappointing end to the season. And I mean, just think of it: if they beat New Orleans, they might have just been able to outright. They would have won the division and been in the playoffs if they just beat New Orleans that second to last week of the year. But nope. They had to just blow it like that, and they blew a big opportunity. And I think this team's going to be still a big contender for a playoff spot next year, but man, that's going to really hurt how that was a demoralizing end to the season. That could really come back to bite him in the ass next season. Now we get to one of the most interesting teams this year, and I think they are going to be the biggest threat to go to the PFA Bowl 2 next year in the Century Conference, and that's the Miami Sharks. What an absolutely dominant performance this team had this season. But remember, this team started off 1-6. I'm not kidding when I'm saying that. They started off 1-6. But then they were so far back. Dallas was way ahead. New Orleans was way ahead. They were far, far, far back in the Century Conference that they probably would not come back to make it for the playoffs. But they did it. They went on to go 10-1 the final rest of the games of the year to go 11-7, and they somehow made a playoff appearance. They started off the playoffs at San Diego, where they absolutely shit the bed after that incredible turnaround they had and lost 27-10. They blew a big opportunity to possibly be a contender to make it to the PFA Bowl this year after that strong performance, after that shitty start. And you know what's unbelievable? All 7 of those losses were within a touchdown to win. Think about that. This team could have possibly gone 18-0, and we didn't even notice that because of their shitty start. I mean, Omaha was the best team this year at 15-3, and they lost all their 3 games, were by humongous margins Miami lost more than twice as many games, but they were close as hell. This team could have easily gone 18-0, and that is unbelievable how they blew that chance so up badly. If they just won even just 2 of those games, they might have put themselves in a first-round bye contender, and who knows what would have happened if they made the playoffs. But anyways, then you get to the stats. They were 6th in scoring, which is pretty impressive. They were 9th in yards. That's really good. They were the number 1 rush offense in the league. Think about that, because I think it was we found out New Orlando earlier was second best. So we have a division that has the 2 top running teams in the league. That's really impressive. Getting 150 yards on the ground, but they were 31st in the air. So that's not really good, especially when they have Anthony McCormick. I think it was the 2nd overall quarterback pick in this draft. And then in defense, they were the 6th best scorer in defense. That's very good. They were 23rd though against the yards, which is not good. 20th in yards, on the ground, and 25th in the air. So apparently this is like a Tampa 2 defense. Remember how the Buccaneers used to be from 1996 to 2008. Bend, but don't break. They allowed a lot of yards, yeah, but they did not allow a lot of points off of it. When it came to quarterback play, their quarterback, Anthony McCormick, the 27th overall pick in the draft, who I'm sure the Kansas City Hammerheads are regretting taking Henry Settles now after seeing how McCormick did. After a struggling start, he threw for almost 3,500 yards, 24 touchdowns, just 6 picks, and an almost completion percentage of almost 2/3. He had a dominant performance this year, although that very terrible start to the year really hurt his stats. And as we get to the rushing yards, their leading rusher surprisingly was Douglas Jackson with just over 1,200 yards, but he got 12 touchdowns off of it, so he was very productive when it came to touchdowns. And right behind him, Christopher Poole, who didn't start a single game this year, who was just 2 yards short of 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns too. So how about that? This team had 2 running backs that almost went for 1,000 yards each. And oh boy, this team had 2 incredible wide receivers. Edward Miller with 106 receptions, over 1,300 yards and 8 touchdowns, and right behind him was Victor Green with 111 receptions for over 1,300 yards and 8 touchdowns. So this team has a very good quarterback, 2 very good running backs, 2 very good receivers. How the hell did this team not struggle so bad to start the year? Probably their biggest weakness, though, on offense, that offensive line. It's not like bad, but it's just average. So they probably got to get to work on fixing that to get this team right for next year. And then we get to defense with their leading tackler being Anthony Lewis, their linebacker, with 131 tackles. And right behind him is their other linebacker, Norman Crittenden, I think that's how it's pronounced, with 110 tackles. This team has obviously a very good linebacker core. This team got a lot of sacks, but no, it was like really spread out, so no one really led the league team in sacks pretty much. It was like a freeway tie for sacks with 7. Team also did not get that many interceptions, like around the middle of the pack, but their leading interceptor was Shannon Wilson, their cornerback, who had 7 picks, so he had a very good season. Man, it's really hard to believe if this team did not start off 1-6. This team could, I'm serious, this team could have honestly gone 18-0 if you look at it, since all their games they lost were so close. They really had a shot to go 18-0, which is incredible because nobody thought of it because they started off 1-6. And if they get the things right, if they fix that offensive line a bit, they fix that defense up a bit, make it force more turnovers. I'm not kidding when I say this. I think not only is this team going to go to PFA Bowl, I think they could really challenge Omaha or whoever else makes it to the PFA Bowl 2 next year for that title. I mean, who's going to challenge them in the Century South? New Orleans is dog shit. They're a team that won the division, but they're still dog shit. I'm going to tell you how much of a dog shit they are in a minute. Dallas is inconsistent, and they're probably going to collapse after that terrible finish this year. Houston and Orlando, you can't trust them. Then you go to the Century West. The best teams were San Diego, San Francisco, and Las Vegas. San Diego is dog shit, and Las Vegas and San Francisco are inconsistent. The Century Central has Chicago, who went to PFA Bowl. I think they're going to suffer a PFA Bowl hangover next year. The only other team would be Kansas City, but they're untrustable after that 0-5 start to the year. The only teams that could probably legitimately challenge Miami for PFA Bowl 2 appearance would be either the Pittsburgh Blitz or the Baltimore Charm. those three teams, Miami, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore, are definitely the three best teams in this conference, and I can't wait to see what happens next year. But we still got one more team to talk about in the Century South. And that last team is the division winner, the New Orleans Jazz. I didn't expect much about this team, and oh boy, they really disappointed. But, believe it or not, they did start off very strong. They were 6-2, and they made it all the way up to 11-4. They then lost to Miami, but then they stunned everyone by beating Dallas at their place to win the division, only to shit the bed next week against New Orleans 42-7 with a possibility of clinching a first-round bye still for grabs. So, anyway, they start off the wild card hosting Baltimore, and they laid a fucking egg. I think it was 38-7. They got barely over 100 yards in the game, while they allowed Baltimore to get over 500 yards, I believe it was. That was the biggest collapse in PFA game history, perhaps. Even that lopsided 51 loss that Houston got, they weren't that bad compared to what New Orleans allowed Baltimore to do against them. That's how shitty they are. And believe it or not, this team is the only team ever in PFA history to go to the playoffs where they allowed more points than they scored. And matter of fact, all 6 of their losses, well, not all of them, but the majority of them, they were blowouts. 30-14 against Honolulu. They got shut out at home against Dallas. 31-14 against Kansas City. 24-14, their best loss, hosting Houston. Then they got blown out 34-14 hosting Miami. And of course that 42-7 thrashing Orlando game in the last week of the year. This team is dog shit, and they are definitely the worst team in the playoffs this year, and I definitely think they're going to have a major collapse this year. But we still got to get to the stats. They were 26 in scoring. They were 32nd in terms of yards, so they did not get a lot of yards, and they did not get a lot of points. They were 28th in rushing yards, so that's not good. They were 30th in pass yards. So again, a team that could not get a lot of yards and points, so how the hell did they advance? Well, we get to defense. They were 19th in yards, means points allowed, so that's pretty good. They were 29th in yards allowed, so that's definitely not good. 25th against the run and 28th against the pass. So overall, a team that won 12 games, 2/3 of their games, and they're this terrible. How did this happen? Well, we're going to get to it in just a minute. You know, it's very surprising that this team did so bad, considering the fact that their quarterback, James Williams, actually had a pretty good year. He threw for almost 3,800 yards. He had a completion percentage of almost 63%. He threw 28 touchdowns and just 8 picks. He had a QB percentage of 92.7. So he had a really good performance this year. But in terms of their running game, their leading rusher was Luther Starr, who just had barely over 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns. Matter of fact, their backup, James Coburn, who had more production, almost 850 yards, but 8 touchdowns. So their running game was definitely not really that good. And their receiving core is one-man show with Mark Batson having over 112 receptions, almost 1,500 yards, but he only got 9 touchdowns out of it. So that's not really that good in terms of touchdowns for all those yards he got in receptions. An average offensive line. Then we get to defense, which might explain later on why they may have gone 12-6 for such a shitty team. But first, their leading tackler was their linebacker, Jeffrey Cornell, one of the best linebackers in the league, with 154 tackles, who also got 4 sacks and 2 picks. That's really impressive. Their other linebacker, Keith Garcia, with 145 tackles and 3 sacks. And their other linebacker, Joe Farley, with 113 tackles and 1 sack. Man, this is starting to look like the Dome Patrol that the New Orleans Saints had, that great linebacking core of the 80s and 90s. But then you get to sacks, and this team got a good amount of sacks, like average, but it's still spread out. Joan Hanley was their leading sacker with just 9. But here we go. This might explain exactly why New Orleans went 12-6 despite not being a good team. They led the league in interceptions. They had 23 interceptions. Their leading interceptor, Thomas Shafee, their cornerback, got 7. Their free safety, Matthew Martins, had 6. And their other cornerback, Michael Engel, had 4 interceptions. That is incredible. And I don't know where I could look this up on PFS to find out who has the best turnover differential in the league, but I'm quite confident it's pretty historic in the NFL. The team with the best turnover differential, regardless of how they do, they will be very good. I mean, look who leads the league right now in turnover differentials in 2016. This is as of week 8 after that Thursday night Jaguars at Titans game. You know who leads the league in turnover differentials? The Vikings. And what are the Vikings? 5-1. But overall, look at the Vikings. They have a very strong defense, but an injury-riddled offense that's going to keep them from, in my eyes, from going all the way to the Super Bowl. But they're 5-1. If the season ended today, they would have first-round bye, for crying out loud. And look at New Orleans Jazz here. They very well have the best turnover differential in the league, because I can't look it up. I mean, they have 23 interceptions. That's pretty good. And they're 12-6. That's pretty impressive for such a bad team to have that many interceptions. And you know that play helped a lot, since they probably took a possible touchdown and took that interception and made it to a touchdown for themselves, which probably won them a whole bunch of games. But there's also another very concerning thing you got to worry about if you're a New Orleans Jazz fan. Turnover differentials change very much over time. Teams that have like a huge turnover differential one year, it's very unlikely for them to get it the next year. So unless the New Orleans Jazz somehow, some way get better, or somehow stay bad, but keep that turnover differential, this team is going to shit the bed. And I think of all the teams that won the division this year, I think they're the major contender to not win it next year. And I would not be surprised if this team made it all the way to first to worst next year. But we'll see. Oh wow, I'm actually surprised how long I talked about the New Orleans Jazz. That went like 6 minutes. I think they took the most time of every team. That's quite impressive. But anyways, that's my recap of the Century South. And hopefully soon, maybe in the next week, I'll make the final video of this recap series of the Century West. And I can't wait to do it. So see you then.